being sustained by drought conditions, which can sustain wildfires and droughts. So our research question for the project is, how will the El Nino change future seasonal precipitation across the globe? The reason why I say the El Nino is because the model actually due to the linear trend of part of them, since they are more biased towards global precipitation, global temperatures increasing in the next few years. The newer index actually helps us find what we can find ENSO as. So we thought EOI is a new index that helps characterize ENSO. It is evaluated by taking the tropical sea surface average over a region in the tropical ocean. So in this project, we decided to do 8 degrees south and 8 degrees north for that threshold. A binary spatial mask is then applied to those maps with the one assigned to sea surface temperatures that at least meet that threshold value, and a 0 assigned to sea surface temperatures less than that threshold value. EOI is then represented as the average of all those longitudes with a spatial mask for sea surface temperatures. To give more of a broader understanding of it, these are the indices for EOI, and it's relatively the most common index objections to find and self-annoying. As you can see, these are the thresholds for extreme La Nina and El Nino events relative to the other ones. And then as you can see, EOI is actually categorized in longitude rather than sea surface temperatures. So this is significant because it helps define the region of deconvection, which is something we weren't fully aware of originally. So the data selection and methods for the project focus more on 2 models from SNP 6. The first model is the MPI for the Max Planck Institute, and the HAD, which is from the UK Met Office. Historical and future data was then pulled from these models to help inform further analysis, with the data range from 1950 to 2014. And from 2020 to 2064, the reason we did not extend to the end of the century is due to the lack of data that was available for the simulations of the models. From this data, we then used it for global precipitation and temperatures, and then the same was applied to observations as well. So the methodology behind this project was to first create EOI values from the thresholds that were defined before. So we took those values and then assigned them to observations, future and historical random models, and then defined what we considered was an extreme El Nino event, extreme La Nina event, and existed from the model. And then from there, we did it for both precipitation and temperature files. This project really focused on precipitation, however, temperature was used in verification. It's a lot easier to confirm what temperatures are because there's a lot of internal atmospheric variability that doesn't affect precipitation. And you can't be 100% certain about how it's 100% accurate. From that, we then have the data plots and maps to further analysis of the project. So to do a historical comparison of the models, the first model located on the right, or sorry, left, is the HAD. So the HAD actually includes the shot El Nino for the historical period. As you can see, there are modestly wet anomalies of precipitation in the equatorial Pacific in a region of drier conditions outside of it. Also focusing on a little bit more local to home, the Western United States, which has significant health connections to ENSO, experiences more wetter conditions in the southern region and more drier conditions in the northern region. Focusing on the MPI is actually interesting because this model never actually took a strong ENSO event, a strong El Nino event during the historical simulation of the model. Based on this, it does not produce nearly as significant precipitation anomalies based on that only being a moderate El Nino event. However, it does show similarities as it's still picking up the region of high precipitation in the Central Pacific, along with drier conditions in southeastern Asia, and same with the HAD as well. As you can see, it also picks up a similar response. Obviously not as intense, but southern, southwestern part of the United States is wetter, with the northern region being more dry. Doing a little further of a model comparison, the HAD, this represents the historical simulation of the HAD from 1950 to 2014, and in the future from 2020 to 2064. This model is a little bit more inconsistent relative to what precipitation trends are going to change with in the future. This model is of medium resolution, so it's not nearly as high compared to MPI, so take that into consideration. As you can see, equatorial Pacific anomaly what appears to actually weaken in the future as the signal becomes a little less as intense as it once was in the past. And then Western United States precipitation, actually, to remember that it showed more weather conditions and rare conditions in the north. This model actually anticipates that precipitation amount are actually going to decrease and that the time to normal area. Just take that into consideration, just remember that last year we did have one of the most intense wildfire seasons in California, so there's something to take into consideration. And it's might be a main concern for this region, along with just water resources as well, heavily populated areas in this region. Our region also made a significant focus is also southeastern Asia. So I remember from the water circulation. During El Niño event, this causes precipitation amounts to decrease in the region of downward motion in this area. So to focus a little more on this, it has actually estimates in the future that precipitation amounts will increase. So to give you a brief overview, this graph, EOI is on x-axis, precipitation amounts in millimeters per month is on y-axis. Higher amounts right here on the right-hand side actually is El Niño events. On the left-hand side is mostly La Niña. As you can see, the historical, which is in purple, represents actually a decrease in precipitation amounts with El Niño, where the future actually represents an increase of precipitation amounts with El Niño. So given this might indicate that our dynamics of ENSO might change in the future. However, I'll only just come from that. But it's something to take into consideration for the structural model. Focusing on the MPI, it's a little bit more consistent trend, as like I said, the moderate is only ever with historical simulation of this model, where it does signal actually a strong El Niño in this case. So in the future, it does look like overall precipitation, let's say, in the central Pacific is going to increase, with the Western United States being pretty consistent, with a little bit more dry in the northern part. However, there still is some wet conditions occurring during until then. And then focusing on the southeastern part of Asia, there actually is going to be an increase less precipitation amounts than in the past. So for this model actually shows a significant decrease in precipitation amounts in the southeastern portion of southeastern Asia. So as you can see, the same axis is like this graph of the last one. However, as you can see, there's a pretty consistent slope with the linear regression of these models with they're just estimated in the future conditions of this can become even more drier during the El Niño, which is significant because there's going to be more droughts and also wildfires. We do have to discuss model biases. So, like I said before, we did these temperatures to help verify the accuracy of the models. Both these models do indicate warmer temperatures than was actually observed by observations. So given this, we have to take into consideration as the extremities that you saw for precipitation response might not be as extreme as they once were, as it's currently represented to the consideration. Also, two recent studies have also been researching into the biases of these models. It has focused on the relationship of the La Niña frequency along with concentration of greenhouse gases. This study, the second one, focuses on the models predict that greenhouse gas concentration will actually decrease the frequency of La Niña events. However, this isn't really the case because in the past few decades, we have actually seen an increase of La Niñas with the consistent greenhouse gas emissions year per minute. Another study is also focused on why in the model what we struggle with. One focused on credit models has a challenging estimating eastern boundary regions, and a big concern for this for ENSO is that the model actually predicts, and as we saw before, more El Niño events, but it doesn't actually represent the sea surface temperatures, with the biases being around 5 degrees warmer than what is actually part of observations. So for that, overall, these winter seasonal precipitation amounts across the globe will vary for different regions, either with drier weather conditions in the future with global warming. Due to model experiences and biases, it's challenging to conclude direct response and across the globe. They have to know that there's still uncertainty with the future of ENSO, and there's still more research being done on how to understand it. And then for future work, you'll probably involve this work comparisons with models just to focus more and gather more consistency as this project will include. I'd like to thank my mentors, Dr. Pascola and Dr. Alex Gonzalez. I also would like to thank everyone who's a part of the research symposium for making this happen, regardless of the circumstances. I'd also like to thank the World Climate Research Program and Team 6 for use of their data, along with the CDC Global Unified Precipitation Data use to this project. These are my resources. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Awesome, thank you very much. Any questions for Alyssa?
So I know you mentioned use of the HAD model in your project, and so I'm actually using some data from that model in my project I'm presenting on as well today. And so one thing that we've noticed, particularly going out further into future climates, is that the HAD model behaves, it seems to us like quite anomalously compared to a lot of the others. So I'm curious, you mentioned some of the characteristics about how it performs relative to observations. Were there any other factors to that effect that you noticed when collecting data for the HAD model?
Yeah, so this model was showing things a little bit differently than the other models. I think one thing that might take into play is maybe the resolution of the model and also some of the forcings associated with that as well. I'm trying to remember from last semester, there were some other issues with this model as well, as there actually wasn't as much consistencies with it. So I'm wondering if it has to do with a representation of sea surface temperatures and actually overall simulating that everything is a lot warmer than actually, because the historical simulation of this it characterized everything as an ENSO event, as El Nino. No La Niñas existed in this, so it was significantly warmer than the other ones. So I think it's a huge bias that's in play.
Other questions? I have a fairly naive question. What is the interest from different parts of the globe to use these sort of predictions and these different models to try to maybe make decisions for things as simple? Should we think about maybe doing different sort of maybe crops or other things like that for drying or getting weather? Is there a large appetite for different countries around the world to take this information into account and make some of those decisions?
Yeah, no, this definitely is. I'm not familiar with the global perspective as much. I'm not as knowledgeable, but however, the United States border and climate does affect our growing season as well, because the teleconnections that it does have those precipitation and temperature responses, which of course, you need temperatures to be warm enough to grow crops, or precipitation amounts to sustain these crops as well. So it's actually a huge thing, and that's why we're really concerned about knowing how ENSO will change in the future, and then the predictions as well of how it might. So we are more accurately prepared for whatever conditions that might happen that year.
Cool. Awesome. Thanks. Any other questions you have for our speaker? All right, let's take a listen one more time. Can I get the data? Can we get your presentation over? Yeah. And there another view maybe. Yeah. I have to just drag it up and do the little play. Oh, there you go. That does it. And then this guy, it's just this little bottom one to read for you. Just all right. So everybody, our next speaker is Ada Ellingworth from William Gutowski's lab, and she's going to tell us about object-oriented analysis of observed, contemporary, and scenario precipitation accumulations. So welcome, Ada. Take us away.
Thank you. So once again, I am Ada Ellingworth, and I will be presenting today on the object-oriented analysis of observed, contemporary, and scenario precipitation accumulations. I've been working on this with Brandon Feisel and Dr. William Gutowski from the Department of Geological and Atmospheric Sciences, and with Dr. Linda Schenk from the Department of English at Iowa State University. For our research, we have been focusing on precipitation, and we have been doing this because precipitation plays a very large role in our lives. It shapes everything around us, especially here in Iowa. Into the future, we want to consider how precipitation is going to change and how those changes will impact us. In order to do that, we have used object-oriented analysis of 2 data sets in order to understand how these precipitation events of 5-day accumulations will change. 5-day accumulations occur when we have 5 continuous days with at least 1 day of precipitation within. For example, if we were to have a 2 duration continuous event, we would have 2 different 5-day accumulations. The first would be, for example, on a Monday. So then that 5-day accumulation would count for Monday through Friday. And then our second one, if it were on Tuesday, would count for Tuesday through Saturday. Together, this would make a 2-duration event, which then we are able to refer to as our object. For our analysis, we analyze these 5-day accumulations under a number of aspects. The first of these is our threshold. And our threshold is our amount of precipitation received over each 5-day period. So for our research, we used a threshold of 25 millimeters, as that was the amount of precipitation that tended to be an approximate amount for each 5-day accumulation. For our second aspect, we looked at the count, or the number of events for our time period. This was important in our comparisons, as we wanted to see how many events we had for our model data and for our observed data. Then we looked at our area, which was our size of the event over our overall region, and finally our duration, which is how many 5-day accumulations we had for each event. For our region, we focus on North Central North America, or NCNA region, which is, as shown on the map, it is in the upper Midwest. We chose this region due to the importance of precipitation for the crops here. And since large changes in precipitation amounts might have drastic impacts on the landscape. And then for our data sources, we chose an observational set and a simulated data set. For our observational set, we chose the PRISM data set. And then for our simulated data set, we chose the Reg CM4 GFDL data set. Both of these data sets have a time period from 1981 to 2001. This table here was able to be generated from our object-oriented analysis. This table shows the event count, or number of events over our time period for PRISM at a threshold of 25 millimeters. And these 25 millimeters of precipitation are accumulated over 5 days, as mentioned earlier. In order to read this graph, we need to pay attention to a number of aspects. The first is the time period. So our time period is here on the left, and it goes from 1981 to 2001. Then along the top, we have our months of the year. And lastly, we have the total number of events for every year. Then our next part we need to pay attention to is the color of the cells. For our white cells, such as seen here, these cells represent the lowest 25% of our frequency. So these months are months that have the lowest number of events overall. Then in the middle, where we have a number of green cells, these are the months that had a middle range of 25 to 75% of events. So these were the months that had a number of events that made up 25 to 50% of our total events. And then lastly, we have our blue cells here in the middle. And these blue cells have the highest frequency of events per month, with these being 75% to 100%. With this, we are then able to interpret the graph and gain a better understanding of what it means. For our lowest months, where we have these lowest precipitation events, this means that we are likely seeing not as many events, which is likely due to synoptic patterns during the winter months, such as January, February, and December. Then as compared, we have our blue months in the middle from May to September, and these are likely modeling more synoptic systems, which then occur more frequently due to their smaller size. And then lastly, in the shoulder seasons of fall and spring, we see a mix where we're having that transition. That changed. Okay, so then here we have a similar data table, but it is for our Reg CM4 GFDL data set, which is our simulated data set. This is showing the same data except for our Reg CM4 GFDL set. And so therefore we have the same years, although we do see an increase in the total number of events. One thing to note for this is that we see an overall similar model as compared to our PRISM data set. And this is important due to the fact that it shows this correlation and that we're able to come to a conclusion based on this. Lastly, from this, we're able to reach a number of findings. Firstly, we know that our models, based on how we're seeing, are showing shorter durations and larger areas, especially in the winter, which is showing a slight seasonal variation. Other than that, our models compare very well with our observations, as shown in our previous table. Based on that, we're able to come to a conclusion that our model will be able to show behaviors for future climates that are similar to our contemporary models, but will therefore show more frequent events. In addition to this, we are also applying our work to other work, including climate outreach efforts, in order to help inform the public about how these precipitation events may change into the future. If you have any questions, feel free to reach myself or my fellow researchers at our emails listed above. Once again, a large thanks to Brandon Feisel and Dr. William Gutowski from the Department of Geological and Atmospheric Science, and to Dr. Linda Shin from the Department of English. And also, thank you to you.
Thank you. Got some questions for Ada?
On your figures, so I guess your plots, I noticed there are some cells that have asterisks in them. Can you explain what those mean and what they are?
Yes, those asterisks are indicating certain intensities, and our blue cells where we have the asterisks, such as, well, let's go back. So here, if we look in, like here, where we have 155 with an asterisk, this is indicating a 90 percentile or higher. So these are the very highest frequencies. Or in our white, where we have it, such as 4 in January of 1984, this is our 10%. So which is our lowest frequencies. So through that, we're seeing just where we're having the highest frequencies and the lowest frequencies.
Thank you.
Other questions? I have a question for you, Ada. So are these tile charts that you showed, are these for that north central region where we are here in Iowa?
Yes, they are.
So it looks like to me that generally the temperature kind of follows the amount of precipitation. Like, so the winter usually less precipitation than the summer, which has the most precipitation. Is it kind of a general trend? Is that right?
Not quite. This is the number of events. So these are where we had at least 5 days or more of accumulations, which at our threshold, which is 25 millimeters, is not a necessarily large amount. So when we're seeing these events, that means that we're just seeing more often events, not necessarily lots more precipitation than in, say, the winter than the summer.
Yeah, so I guess my question is related to that. Is that the same for the other geographical regions in the US? Do they follow this same trend as having more events in the summer versus the winter? Or is it kind of a mixed bag, just depending on where you live in the US?
It's been a bit of a mixed bag depending on where, due to different patterns.
Excellent, thank you. Any other questions for Ada?
Quick question. Yes. So yeah, really nice talk. I was curious. So this is my first spring living in Iowa, but I presume that the growing season is kind of just starting up. And I noticed that about where we are in that graph, we say we're almost in May. There's quite a bit of variability in going from blue to green shading. So I was curious if the results that you found for precipitation, if that's any indicator of what we might be able to expect with the growing season. Like, are there any particular months where this variability in the precipitation info is most important? And that might be kind of a hard question because it's connecting it to agricultural data.
So just to clarify, your question is about how the precipitation variability around this time affects the growing season?
Yeah, like are there any particular months where the findings may be particularly important for the growing season?
It's kind of a corollary to her question. Right now, we have about 5% of corn and soybeans have been planted.
Okay,
And a lot of that's based on, purposely done based on just the soil temperature, so a lot of the southern part of our state. But also because of that variability around here, maybe that helps give you a little more context for kind of the question.
Yes, I personally am not very aware of how the growing seasons, especially here in Iowa, work. But I would guess that, yes, that variability is very important when planting.
great. Yeah, it seems like your work would have really important implications for the future as well. Very nice.
Yeah, I agree because right now, when people are starting to think about the planting season, and there's a lot of risk if you plant and then it's cold and wet versus if you plant later, by then it's already starting to get a little bit drier or warmer than usual. So yeah, I think it's really interesting. Any further questions for Ada? Okay, let's take Ada one more time. Yeah, just the bottom button and see if you can get your PowerPoint all fired up.
I tweaked it a little bit today. Yes, that looks right.
Perfect. So our next speaker is Nathan Erickson, who's also mentored by Dr. William Katowski. And his talk today is going to be evaluating contemporary and scenario 30-day precipitation events using object-oriented analysis over the Missouri River Basin.
Yes.
Take us along.
All right. Well, thank you for the introduction and thanks to all of you for showing up. Appreciate having you hear my talk today. So it's kind of unfortunate timing. My topic is actually very similar to Ada's. So I'll be explaining a lot of similar phenomenon, sort of a different focus in mine as compared to hers, but I'll try not to bore you too much with a repeat of details on this. So I click through this a little bit. So yes, as mentioned, my topic is on evaluating contemporary and scenario 30-day precipitation events using object-oriented analysis over the Missouri River Basin. And so, like I mentioned, this is a bit of a different focus from David, but this time we're looking at 30-day precipitation events, so a bit longer in time scale, and we're looking at the Missouri River Valley Basin. So it's a similar region to the north central region. Extended a little bit further to the west, and we're specifically looking at impacts on its hydrological system and how it can affect all the components of our hydrological cycle going forward. Another thing I would like to note before I advance, at the stage of this project where it currently is, we primarily focused on comparisons between observed and contemporary model data, and going forward, we're going to look more at the impacts of scenario model data. So for some background on this, Ada already discussed object-oriented analysis some, but essentially to kind of reiterate on that, what we're doing and the purpose of using object-oriented analysis is to classify, all of these different precipitation events that we have, in order to effectively observe and model this. We have millions of data points over a region like the United States. And so we use object-oriented analysis to sort of collect these data points into coherent, we call them blobs. It's very scientific, I know. And we do that to be able to recognize these as events that are easily understandable and able to be put into context for our work. And in order to do that, we utilize a package of scripts known as Tempest Extremes. So that essentially prepares all of the precipitation data and transforms it into these blobs. And then from there, we utilize a variety of post-processing scripts to get our final results for this project, which I'll discuss in a little while. So as far as our motivation for this project, so we are using the Missouri River Valley Basin as our domain. As I mentioned, this basin is very significant for a lot of different factors in the United States. So it is a huge component in the hydrological cycle of the US, lots of impacts on agriculture throughout the country because of its size and its location within the United States. And then relating specifically to the models that we are using, it's sort of a twofold purpose that we have. So one of these is to understand our current model performance. That's why we're looking at contemporary model data as compared to observed precipitation data. That allows us to most effectively evaluate how our models are actually standing up against reality, and to know, what factors we might need to adjust in our models, what we might need to tweak to be able to most effectively model future precipitation events, which kind of there leads into my second point on this slide of the prediction of future climate outcomes. Obviously, in the context of climate change, it's very, very important to be able to understand what exactly our climate is going to do, what observed precipitation changes we will have. And so being able to evaluate our models in this present time frame is very important to allow us to refine the models for predicting future climate outcomes. So as far as our data, we have 13 input data sets for this project. So as Ada mentioned, we are also using the PRISM observational data, ranging from 1981 to 2001. That is our reference for the contemporary time frame. And then we have 5 base and scenario case pairs. So the base, that refers to our contemporary models ranging from 1981 to 2001 for our project. And then the scenario is from 2079 to 2099. So we're essentially modeling discrepancies between our contemporary time period and the end of this century. One note on that, however, as I alluded to actually in my question to Alyssa earlier, is that we've noticed the HAD, or HADGA model as we call it, has been somewhat anomalous. It doesn't really compare well against the other models. And so we've opted not to really take into account the results of that one for our project. And then there are also 2 standalone base cases that are forced by some of our regional and global climate models that do not have a corresponding scenario pair. As I mentioned earlier, this analysis is performed over the Missouri River Valley Basin. And there's an image of it here on the right. So you can see that really covers a significant portion of the central United States. Its impacts can be felt really across much of the Midwest. It's somewhat close to home, not exactly covering Ames, Iowa here, but it is somewhat close to us, and so it can have a significant impact on our water use and agriculture here nearby. So as far as our methodology goes for this project, I mentioned there's the Tempest Extremes package that's used to actually process the data. And then we have a variety of scripts to evaluate the blobs that are created by that package. And from there, we evaluate at a variety of different thresholds. So for our 30-day time scale, we're looking at precipitation at 150 millimeters, 300 millimeters, 600, 900, and 1200 millimeters. And I will allude to this a bit later as well, but one thing to note is that oftentimes we don't even see any precipitation at all reaching the upper thresholds, particularly in the contemporary climate. And so instances where we do see that are hinting at very extreme precipitation events. And we may be seeing a slight uptick in those in future climate modeling events. And so additionally, we do post-processing visualization for this. So unfortunately, we're not quite on this stage for my project. However, this image here is sort of a representation of what we will eventually see in terms of our visualized results. So each one of these dots here on this picture represents one blob, one sort of storm event. And then all these collected together, for instance, the greens you see there, or the reds or the blacks, those would be a coherent collection of them over our time period for which we're performing the analysis. So for the results and analysis that we've collected so far, as I mentioned earlier, at this point, we are primarily focusing on evaluation of the contemporary model with respect to the observed data that we have from PRISM observational data. And so we have the structuring of results similar to what you saw earlier. And this graph that, or this chart, excuse me, that I have here is for the 50th percentile of intensity for the events within this model. This is specifically from the PRISM observational data. And so what we're looking at here is what collection of events fall within a certain statistical range for this. I'm looking at sort of very broad scale numerical trends, and eventually trying to synthesize this down into somewhat more intelligible, easy to interpret results. But here, essentially, this is showing you the 50th percentile of all these different percentiles of this precipitation intensity. So as mentioned earlier, the green is within the interquartile range, so from the 25th to the 75th percentile. The blue events are over the 75th percentile, with those denoted with an asterisk above the 90th percentile. And then those events shown in white are below the 25th percentile, and those with an asterisk are below the 10th percentile. And so the sort of analysis that we're looking to actually do on this to evaluate our contemporary models is really boils down to asking what compares well to our PRISM observational data. And if we can determine that, we can see which models are most effective in the contemporary climate regime, and hopefully determine which ones will be most effective in predicting future climates as well. So continuing on with my results and analysis, as I mentioned earlier, most of our events only ever reach the 600 millimeter threshold for any of the cases. There are only a few of the models that ever go past 600 and reach the 900 millimeter threshold. So that is something worthy to note. Additionally, we have a lot of similarities at the lower thresholds. I have on this graph sort of a simplified representation of that, the different percentile intensities for a variety of different contemporary models. So the PRISM observation data here on the left, and then our 5 different contemporary models over there to the right, representing different pairings of the regional and global climate models. And you can see in terms of these different percentiles, really there's not a whole lot of difference where all of these fall. You know, even the 90th percentile, which is furthest away from that threshold where we might expect the most stratification, there's really only a difference of about 6 millimeters in that 90th percentile. So we're seeing a lot of consistency across these events, particularly at the lower thresholds. In terms of cross-case differences, they're stratified somewhat more at the higher thresholds. However, at these lower ones where we have a high significance of events, like I mentioned, they're quite similar in most of our observations. So for our conclusions, for some variables, most of our cases, most of those contemporary models exhibited strong consistency, even when compared to the observational data. I would stress that a lot of this is based on initial assessment. As I mentioned, this project is still ongoing. And so there is a lot of further work to be done and more rigorous statistical testing that we would like to do in the future. However, just based on that initial assessment, the most accurate ones we've determined overall so far appear to be the GFDL paired with the RegCM4, that global and regional climate model pairing, the ERA interim paired with the RegCM4, and then the ERA interim paired with the WRF regional climate model. So those are the 3 that we think perform best here in this contemporary time period. So as far as takeaways and further work that we'd like to do in the future, it seems that we have a set of relatively effective contemporary models, and so that allows us a strong basis for predicting future scenarios. And as I mentioned, we want to do a lot of analysis on scenario climate forecasts in the future. That's kind of the purpose of this project. And the second aspect that we're going to get to here in the future. And one just initial observation that we've gotten here is that we typically have much higher event counts in the future relative to our contemporary climate period. And finally, kind of the last takeaway I alluded to in our analysis section is that we are observing a somewhat similar performance across a lot of our models in the contemporary period. So on the last slide, I have contact information for myself and my mentor, Dr. Brandon J. Feisel, is a postdoctoral fellow here, as well as Dr. William Patowski, Jr. He is a professor and the overall supervisor for this project. I would like to acknowledge both of them in the role that they've played in guiding and mentoring me for this project. And yes, that's all I have. I'll be glad to take any questions. Yeah,
just noticed that on your chart with all the events listed on it, that there were some squares that were just blank and didn't have numbers. Do you know like what caused that to not have any data for it?
Yeah, so for these specifically, since this is the observed data, I believe that those represent months simply where there was not observed data reported for whatever reason. I don't believe that's because there was no precipitation that fell at all in that time period. It's possible that there were no events that actually reached that 150 millimeter threshold within that time period. Yeah, that's kind of the likely explanation for that.
Another question?
Oh, so going back to the hat, I'm just curious, how much did it differ between relative to the other models that you've used for this project?
Right, so I was not directly involved with looking at the large scale modeling that was done by the HAD or the HADGEM model, we called it. Dr. Feisel, my mentor on this, refers to it as the HADGEM being all out of whack. He said its atmosphere is very strange. But for this one, what we observed specifically with respects to event counts in our contemporary period was that it often modeled many, many more events than we actually experienced. Typically within the contemporary period, it was on the order of about 5,000 events at the lower thresholds. And the HADGEM was modeling somewhere around 8,000. So not close at all to what we actually observed. As far as the other variables, it may have been a bit closer, but obviously it wasn't doing a good job of modeling the actual physics of the atmosphere to get the proper amount of events. And so that was kind of the main aspect of it that was problematic with respect to this project.
Any other questions for Nathan? I have a quick question for you. It might be a little bit too far in the background. When you're doing models like this to try to predict what the climate might be moving forward in the future, does it seem like the models that are for more recent data, like let's say the last 10 years, trying to predict the next 10 years versus the last 100 years, trying to predict the next 10 years, do they just show you different things, or do more data and more historical data help predict for the future? There's more recent events and more recent data, a better indicator of moving to the future.
Right, sure. So that's actually a great question that gets to a lot of the challenge that we're observing in weather modeling, climate modeling in general these days, because it's a really big issue being able to properly synthesize data and determine what are the appropriate, appropriate characteristics, the appropriate factors to incorporate into it. In terms of the archive of data, really being able to have as much historical data as possible is ideal. The more observed data we can have, the better our models will be able to perform because they have more of a background to reference, I suppose. In terms of actually improving model performance, the big things are really improving the spatial resolution, so modeling like smaller and smaller grid boxes in terms of space, and the time resolution, so allowing it to work more quickly to generate more time steps for a given period of time. But yeah, to your initial question, basically the more data that we can have that is accurate, right, the better.
Yeah, thanks. Any last questions for Nathan? All right, let's take Nathan one more. Okay, so our next speaker is Grace Hanson, who's also mentored by Dr. Chris Patricola, and her talk is going to be future projections of sea surface temperature and salinity from the E3SM climate model, implications for tropical cyclones. So,
Yeah, so as he said, my name is Grace Hanson. I've been working on this research with Dr. Pascal for about a semester now. Okay, so in terms of some background, we're looking specifically at, like I said, upper ocean temperatures and salinity. And the reason that we're looking at this is to look for tropical cyclone formation. So the things that some kind of like elements that are important for that tropical cyclone formation is the warm ocean temperatures for like 0 to 100 meters on the depth of the ocean. So, and then instability in the atmosphere, vertical wind shear, which just helps like mix and create the moisture aloft. And then you need convection, which is just like a bunch of clouds like all together in order to kind of be that trigger and pull everything together to create those tropical cyclones. So this is a figure pulled straight from NOAA from actually like a couple weeks ago, or April 8th, I think is the official day of accurate sea surface temperatures in the ocean right now. So the red indicating warmer temperatures all the way up to the blue indicating cooler temperatures. So that just gives you kind of a background of what the sea surface looks like right now. And then, okay, so in terms of specifically why we use these variables, so salinity, there's not quite as much data on how salinity has affected the tropical cyclones, but there is research done about there being an inverse relationship between the rapid intensification of a tropical cyclone, which is its ability to go from a tropical storm to a hurricane very, very quickly. But like I said, there's ongoing research about that, so that's why it was important for us to include that in this data. And then upper ocean temperatures, obviously, it's pretty well known that warmer temperatures are going to cause tropical storm to increase and intensify more quickly. And this is because if there's a lot of strong winds, it causes that mixing that I talked about. And so if the ocean is cooler a little bit lower down, that water can then get sucked up and then can actually weaken the storm. So if we have sea surface temperatures all the way down to upper ocean temperatures that are all consistently warm, that means that the tropical cyclone just has more warm water to suck up, and thus it just becomes stronger. So that's why we looked at 0 to 100 meters, so that 5, 50, and 100, in order to get a strong comparison of how deep that warm water actually is. So our research question was, how are upper ocean temperatures and salinity projected to change in the future, and what could this mean for the tropical cyclone formation, intensity, and intensification rate? So again, we're looking at, I'll show you in a minute, but historical, what it has done over a period of time, and then how this could change in the future. So the model that we use is the Energy Exascale Earth Systems Model, or E3SM. And again, like I said, we're looking at the historical from 1850 to 2014, and these are the elements that are used in that model. So greenhouse gas emissions and climate forcing to kind of develop how, and then in the future, it uses these same variables to develop what it thinks that the temperatures and salinity will do in the future. And that second one goes from 2014 to 2100. So this is at 5 meters depth in the Atlantic region, so 100 to negative west to 20 east. So we can see here, this one is the historical. So we can see from 1980 to 2014 what the sea surface temperatures average look like, and this is in September specifically. So then you can see obviously here a significant increase between the two temperature-wise, and then this is just a range, so like the future minus the historical, and so you can see exactly the amount of big regions that you have in that. I mean, this is at the 5 meter depth, and so this is the same region at the 100 meter depth. So again, you can see here that the water, like right in the Gulf specifically, is kind of cooler, but then you can see like in the blue region, right? So, but then here it becomes this kind of orange color, and then you see even the red at the 100 meter depth. So this is obviously significantly deeper, and this water being this temperature would cause very rapid intensification of the tropical cyclones. And again, we see the range here. So areas where you're having significant increase in temperatures here, as well as here. And then here's the same region on the salinity data. So looking specifically at how the salinity changes over time. Here we see an increase specifically in the Gulf region, and over here as an increase, a positive increase, as well as some negative like decreases in the amount of salinity. And this is at the 5 meter depth. So again, we see throughout the same somewhat of the same region, they see the temperature increase. You're also seeing the salinity increase. And then again, at 100 meters, these changes aren't as significant, just because as you're getting the density of the ocean, you're not seeing quite so much variability all the way down. but you do still see somewhat of an increase in these. And then we also decided to do another case study on the different regions. So this region is from 180 west to 90 west, so over in the in the West Pacific. And this region was very interesting. Specifically, again, you see at 5 meters a significant increase in temperature, and the range going up quite significantly. But then when you look at the 100-meter depth, you actually see in this area a region of cooling. So the specific model has projected that there will be a region here of pretty significant cooling, which would be very important to tropical cyclones in this region, because again, we have that water that mixes, and this could cause actually some storms not to be quite as strong. So it's just something to watch, especially like relating to some of the stuff that Alyssa talked about, specifically for this region, and how these temperatures could change over time. And then for the same region, we have the salinity data. So in this region, we did not see very much of a change, but there is a little bit of change here in terms of this is at the 5-meter depth and then at 100-meter depth. But it's just, you know, interesting to look at in comparison to the temperature data. So whereas before we saw in the area where there was significant heating, we saw also some like a change in salinity. We're here in the region where there's cooling, there's not quite as much of a change, but still very interesting to note. So in summary, obviously in the Atlantic region, we see that both temperature and salinity have significant increases, and that's between the historical and future. And then we also see that that's at 5-meter depth, but we see similar changes at 100-meter depth, which is really in this region what's important, because again, having that warm water deeper is going to cause rapid intensification of the storms, because you'll still have very like warm water lower down for the storm to then flow. And then in the Eastern Pacific, we also see again that there are increases in temperature and salinity, which was to be expected because obviously there is global warming. But we do see that the changes are opposite for the 100-meter depth, and there's a cooling trend, and the salinity only has a slight increase. So this is obviously shown that it's different from the Atlantic, and could cause actually these storms to not be quite as strong as the ones that would possibly be forming up in the Atlantic. So I'd like to thank Dr. Patrick Cola for helping me with this project and the data. And the data again was obtained from the Energy Exoscale Earth Systems, which is sponsored by the Department of Energy. And the Department of Energy was what Dr. Patrick Cola used for her grant. And then I'd also like to thank the MHP Mentor Program and Dr. Zabarska for helping me get this project presented. And I think that's it. That's it.
Thank you, Greg. Questions for Grace? Grace, I have a question for you to start us off. So looking as you look at kind of the upper ocean and then the deeper ocean temperature changes, and then trying to use that to predict the likelihood of the tropical cyclones. Does that data, or do the difference in temperatures of the upper and lower, do those change on like a yearly or seasonal basis? Or are you looking at like this decade to this decade, we're seeing these changes more gradual?
So you'll see, like, obviously there's variability with seasons. Like I said, I showed you the data from right now in April, whereas the data that we took was specifically from September. So, and obviously there's hurricane season is from like May to the November 1st. So there is variability there, but there's also then what we looked at specifically for the data was the variability of the same month, September, over the period of time, future or present, like historical from the 1885 to 24 to, and then the 2014 to 2100. So looking specifically at September, just because that's obviously the month where we've in the past seen the strongest tropical cyclones, and that's typically when ocean temperatures reach their peak throughout the season and then begin cooling. But yes, there is variability within the seasonal, but we specifically focused on September because that's when you're going to see the peak of the temperatures. Yes.
So you compared historical data and E3SM climate model data. So my question is, did you what was the reasoning behind choosing that particular model? Like, did you run like a verification step where you kind of ran that model with, I guess, the years of the historical data to see like how they compare? Like, was there any sort of verification process with the model data?
So the model data, the historical and the future both come from the same model. They're
Got it,
both
okay.
from the energy exascale model. And like I said, that is sponsored by the Department of Energy, which is where the grant came from. So that's why we use that specific model. But yeah, both sets, like the historical and the future, both come from the exact same Department of Energy model. It's not like we use only the future from that one. It's from both.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Any other questions for Grace? All right, let's take Grace one more time.
Let's hope.
The only thing for this we have to power is this little bottom one. She's the green thing.
Oh, okay.
All right, everybody. So our last speaker for this session is Kari Holmes, and she's mentored by Dr. Alan Wanamaker. And the title of her talk today will be Using Known Age Increments in the Marine Bivalve Arctica Islandica, to constrain the marine radiocarbon reservoir effects in the northern Norway coastal waters. Kari, take it.
Hi, everyone. Yes, my name is Kari. And like you said, today I'm going to be using the marine bivalve Arctica Islandica to constrain marine radiocarbon reservoir effect, or MRRE, off of northern Norway. And so I'd like to thank my mentor, Alan Wanamaker, for helping me with this project. We were funded by the National Science Foundation and the Dean's High Impact Award for undergraduate research. Oh. Great. All right, so my outline for this talk, I'm first going to give a little bit of a rationale for this work. I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of ocean circulation in moderating the Earth's climate, and a little bit of why radiocarbon is such a great mass water tracer. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about why we chose the oceanographic setting that we did off the coast of northern Norway. And today I'm going to be answering the question, what is the temporal evolution of the MRRE, or the marine radiocarbon reservoir effect, which I'll explain later, off the coast of northern Norway. And then I'll talk a little bit about methodology, data collection and processing, and radiocarbon analysis. And then I'll discuss what we found out and our summary of our data. So a little bit about my work. So basically carbon-14 formation. The way that you form carbon-14 is in the upper atmosphere. We have to assume that carbon-14 is at an equilibrium level. And so the way that you get carbon-14 in the atmosphere is you're reacting neutrons produced by cosmic rays with nitrogen atoms. And when this happens, the carbon-14 that's produced spontaneously reacts with oxygen in the atmosphere, and this produces carbon dioxide. And that is important because carbon dioxide is what organisms are going to take up versus carbon-14. That is the way that organisms are going to absorb the carbon-14 in the environment. And so carbon-14 in the environment is going to be different in terrestrial versus oceanic systems. And so carbon-14 in the ocean is also going to be variable. There's going to be less carbon-14 or radiocarbon at depth versus at the surface, because at the surface, you'll be able to constantly replenish that carbon-14 and radiocarbon, versus at depth, you are not going to be replenishing it. The only way that you'll be able to get that is either through surface mixing or some type of ocean circulation, which is why ocean circulation is extremely important for our topic. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some different ocean circulation patterns and climate modes that affect this region. So a little bit about the thermal haline circulation, which is kind of crucial to understanding a lot of the different patterns I'm going to talk about. The thermal haline circulation drives water all around the globe. Ocean currents in the upper 100 meters of the ocean are driven by wind, but when you go at depth, wind no longer has an effect after like around 100 meters.
And once you get at depth, the reason that water continues to circulate is due to a change in density, which is controlled by both heat and or temperature and salinity. And so at depth, especially when you get water that's being circulated up to the top of the globe, it starts to get colder, and then it starts to form ice. And when our water starts to form ice, it starts to make the surrounding water way more saline, and dense water will begin to sink to the bottom of the ocean, and that will begin to pull surface water down with it, and that will kickstart the circulation at depth. And so off the coast of northern Norway, it's more important to be looking at the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, which the conditions right off the coast of northern Norway at our testing site are heavily influenced by AMOC. I'm just going to call it AMOC because I don't want to continue to say that name. But feedbacks and interactions among different North Atlantic climate modes are known to modify both precipitation and air temperature and sea surface temperature and salinity. And so, but it's difficult to establish really long-term trends because the variability of the AMOC in the past is poorly constrained. So long-term records of climate variability are needed to evaluate to evaluate the various modes and understand North Atlantic climate variability. So another two ocean circulation climate modes that are important for this region would be the NAO and the AMO. So the North Atlantic Oscillation, or the NAO, is a decadal oscillation, and the NAO and the AMO both play significant factors into the AMOC, which is what I talked about on the previous slide. So the NAO and the Atlantic multidecadal oscillation are feedback interactions in the North Atlantic climate modes, and they are known to modify both precipitation and air temperature and sea surface and salinity as well. But and the NAO can be linked to different changes in ocean properties and circulation, surface temperature, but a lack of data is making it difficult to determine if any long-term trends or circulation exists. And the AMO is another climate mode that's on a longer time scale of almost 60 to 80 years. And the AMO can have variability in feedbacks, again, with the ocean atmosphere and sea ice. But empirical evidence for the AMO and the AMOC relationship is lacking. We don't really have a solid basis to or reliable long-term trends to secure connection to behavior between the two modes. And so our understanding of like the AMO genesis and early mechanisms is incomplete. That's why research like this is important, to try to understand that connection. So the reason that we're going to be using radiocarbon as a mass water tracer is the fact that the oceans are very large carbon-14 reservoirs. And so radiocarbon, though, throughout the ocean is not homogeneous. There are lots of variation from the surface all the way to depth. Like I talked about before, radiocarbon at the surface can be replenished, but radiocarbon at depth is not replenished. And so it's a very good tracer for where these different water masses are coming from and where we can locate them. And so at deep waters, like I said, it can get mixing from the surface as well as radioactive decay from organisms decaying at deeper depths. So that's why we decided to use radiocarbon for this project. There's another graph, and you can see on this graph, radiocarbon, as you can see, there's lots of variability. There's higher amounts on the surface versus at depth. And another thing that affects this is ocean circulation and upwelling. So not only does radiocarbon vary from like the surface to at depth, it also varies laterally too. If you get upwelling along the coast or due to change in ocean topography, it can affect the radiocarbon levels as well. So as you can see on the map, we chose this site off of northern Norway. And this site is a very unique site, and it's very great for this type of research because it kind of allows you to combine like a bunch of different of these modes all in one area and can help you understand this exact location. So the important thing about this location is recently, due to anthropogenic forcing, there is a increase in surface air temperatures and a decrease in sea ice extent in the Arctic. So this type of research is important as we go forward, and anthropogenic forcing continues to affect this area. So coastal northern Norway is an ideal location due to its proximity to one of the main pathways of Atlantic water entering the Barents Sea, namely off the eastern branch of the NAC, which is the North Atlantic Current. And the North Atlantic Current is just basically the surface, it's one of the surface currents of the AMOC. And so variability in the surface currents of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation. So variability in the NAC can help give us an idea of variability in the AMOC. So feedbacks here in this location though need to be better understood. Long-term annually resolved records of climate variability are going to be needed to evaluate the influence of these various modes on the North Atlantic climate variability and understanding proxy response to different environmental variability in this region can provide insight to different climate forcings and reasons that ocean currents may be changing or that we might be getting influences of new freshwater within this region. So this is the Arctica Icelandica bivalve. And so off this research site, there was a boat that went down to the bottom of the ocean, dredged up a bunch of sediment and collected a bunch of these different Arctica Icelandica bivalves. And they're found a lot in these northern, more cooler regions. That's where they thrive. And so these ones were taken right from that region in the northern North Atlantic. The nice thing about these shells is that they have continuous growth banding. And so that allows us to make annually resolved data chronologies of marine environmental variability. And it allows us to incorporate, carbon isotopes in a consistent manner. And the oxygen isotopes will tell us a lot about material, or will tell us a lot about seawater temperature and seawater isotopic composition. So that's why these shells are perfect and they live a crazy long time. I was working on a shell that was 600 years old. This project. So if you want to see this is kind of what I do in the lab here at ISU. So I take these shells and we cut them up, and it's a very long, tedious process, but it's worth it. We have to slice them and then we put them in this kind of epoxy and then we polish the top of it, and we're able to get a very high resolution image then, or we can take a chemical peel of the top of this shell and we can see all of the exact different annual growth increments in years, and we can very specifically analyze and sample different years within this shell. And so here's what one of those peels looks like. As you can see, it's very high resolution. It's easier to date the specific years off of a shell like this versus what I have to look at when I'm looking through a microscope. It's a lot harder to identify. So I have to go in then with tape and very precisely try to pinpoint the exact layer on the shell. But as you can see, it's kind of like a mix of a lighter and a darker area, and that was about 1 year. So I could specifically sampling each one of those years. And for this project specifically, we were looking at the years from around 1500 to 1900, and we were combining multiple shells in this analysis. And so that instrument that I'm using there is called a micromill, and it mills on the scale of micrometers, so you can't really see it with your eyes when it's moving. You have to use a microscope to go in and plot out different paths. But it allows us to construct a pretty accurate decadal resolution of impossible environmental conditions that are happening in this area. So here were the results that I got from this analysis. So basically, you can see a slight downward trend in radiant carbon. But we did find that mostly for this location, it's consistent with water sourced from the North Atlantic region. But as you can see at the very end, it's starting down, take a downward turn, which could mean that at times older water from the Arctic is beginning to be present within this location, which could indicate science that forth. And so we're hoping that, yes, that addition is potential evidence for increased freshwater influence. And so I was pretty happy with it. Yeah, that's the presentation. I would like to thank my mentor, Dr. Alan Wanamaker, and Dr. Manuel for guidance throughout this project, and Susie in the lab, and the other people in the stabilized lab for helping me with all of my sampling. And I want to thank the people who were involved today to help with the symposium on.
Thank you, Carl. Questions about?
Yeah.
So that's really cool. I have to say, I get to sit behind a computer, which probably requires less patience than that detailed work behind the microscope. So I'm curious to get through the whole process of analyzing data from one shell. How much time does that take?
Oh gosh. So this project, I just showed about 2 shells. Let's see if I go back here. And this is kind of a better image almost. So like that scale bar right there, I mean, it's extremely small. So that's the thing that takes so much time, is going through and analyzing each year. So I'd say that just going through and looking on one shell and trying to get maybe let's say 50 years, that might take me on a microscope, maybe a couple weeks. But then to actually mill the paths on the micromill is what takes a very long time, because you have to then transfer. That's why I put that tape there, because the micromill's microscope or viewing is not as clear. And so you basically just have to really squint and spend a long time trying to stare and make sure you're on the correct year. But it took me probably 3 or 4 months. So it's quite a tedious process. But like I said, the nice thing is you can get such a high resolution with this type of shell. I mean, it's so amazing. I mean, even from this image, you guys can probably see from back there, pretty defined annual growth increments. And so if I can be very careful and I'm between each of my samples, it'll give me a fairly accurate data. So, yeah. Takes a while. Yeah.
Are those growth rings on the shelf somewhat analogous, like growth rings of a tree, like telling you better or worse years for their growth?
Yes. So
Does that have any relationship to exactly what you're measuring? You know what I mean? Because you're looking to see like when you have different changes in like what water is there, right?
yes. Yep. So what I'm looking at is how much radiocarbon is within each of these different years, because that can tell me, different water masses that were coming into those shells' lives at that time, because it affects their growth rate. And so it is kind of like trees, because trees grow from the dark and then the light and the rain. So that is true. I don't remember exactly what the time scale of the year that these shells do grow, but it is on a yearly basis where they have a high period of growing and then it's less. And so that's the dark. You can tell each year by the dark to the light. So it is, very similar to trees. I actually thought that when I first saw the shell, I thought it was like very similar to tree dating, but yeah.
It's amazing. You say they can live up to like hundreds of years?
They can, yes. That's what's so amazing about these shells is they're very great climate proxies, because they don't really move much. I mean, they stay in this one place at the bottom of the ocean and they let tons of different water currents pass over them. So it's a very great stationary climate proxy for analysis. But
So if you have hundreds of years, but the shell's only that big, like it must be tiny little
It's-
different things.
yes, so I'm gonna go all the way back to, it's not gonna let me use it. The beginning. My first slide. So this kind of answers a lot of your questions, but so you can see how tiny that is. And that's actually pretty large. Some of the ones that I'm looking at are even smaller. Like you can't really see that with your plain eye. I mean, it takes a microscope to even begin to see that. But it's amazing how small they are, but how much time that they hold. It's just very fascinating to me. But so cool.
Other questions for Kari? So I think that this is our last speaker. However, we thank all of our speakers for fantastic talks for this session, and thank Kari once again for great talk.
Yeah, thank you guys for being here. I'm gonna go ahead and set up the stuff for the next session.
Yeah, thanks. And I think that concludes our session. Any last, we all set?
Yeah, that's all.
All right. Thank you all for great presentations. It was really fun.
Zoom is still going, correct?
Yeah, I think they said we should turn off the Zoom until.
Yes, we should end that at the end of our session.